Hello everybody, this is Yasmin from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com, and today I'm just going to go through the adjustments panel on your right hand side. Now there's actually two methods that you can use to get some additional adjustments, but I'll be going through that in a different tutorial. So right now I'm just going to cover the adjustments panel that's on your right hand side, and it's just above the layers and channels panel. So on this panel, you'll notice that you do have a couple of buttons here. Now, each of these buttons affect your layers in a similar manner to using the Create New Filler Adjustment layer would. The only difference is these essentially have buttons added to them. That's really the only main difference, because this panel gets reloaded when you do add an adjustments layer anyway, so either way this would show up. So before you get started, in order for me to actually be able to do adjustments on this, I have to unlock my background layer because I flattened this image. So I'm just doing that right now, and all I did to do that is double clicked on that layer and it automatically unlocks it for you once you hit OK. Okay, so now that my layer is unlocked, I'm going to choose the brightness and contrast, and what this does is when I click this, it creates a new layer above whichever layer I had originally selected. Now for the demo tutorial, I actually had the background layer selected, but I did not have my text layer. So for this reason, it's only the background that will be modified, but you'll notice the majority of the changes anyway on the background, so having the image, the text selected is not necessary. So for this, you'll notice that there's two scrollers here. You have one set for your brightness and then one set for your contrast. So what happens when you move the scroller for the brightness is it darkens or lightens the entire piece. Now do be careful when you're using this, because if you lighten it too much, your entire image will look either completely black or it will be dulled out because there's not enough variation in the colors. So I'm just going to undo that because I don't want to keep that. Now if I move the scroller for the contrast, then what it does is it emphasizes the difference between the lights and the darks depending on which way I go. So if I move it on to this side, it lightens the contrast between the light and dark elements. And then if I move it to the right, it increases the contrast. So what it's doing is, after it reaches a certain ratio, is it automatically darkens those colors. And the more you darken it, the darker it gets, and obviously vice versa. So you do have to be careful when you're using either of these tools, because it is quite easy to go overboard for both of these. Now there's another thing that you can do once you have one of these layers actually created, and I showed it in the previous tutorial for the layers, is it automatically creates a layer mask which hasn't been painted on. So if you wanted to, let's say I did change the contrast significantly, just so you'll be able to see the difference, and I had that layer mask selected, I could just paint that in with black and only the area surrounding it will be affected. So essentially I've masked out this one area. Now I'm going to undo that because I don't want to keep that. And the nice benefit to using this tool is that I can turn this on or off, but I can keep my settings. There's also the added benefit of being able to change the opacity of this. So if you did want to be able to control it a little bit more, you can do that with just opacity change. You can also add additional effects to this. So you can change how that layer interacts with any layers below it. So depending on what I choose, in this case I actually chose the dissolve to start off with. I'm going to scroll through the different ones so you can actually see some of the differences. This is the darken, so it changes it slightly. The multiply changes it significantly. Color burn, linear. So there's a bunch of different settings that you can play around with, and each of these settings will interact differently. So what it's doing is it's only affecting how that layer interacts with all the below layers. Let's say I don't like what I just did, that's fine. I can turn it off again once again. Let's say you added this, you turned it off, and you're like, well, I want to try something else, see if I can get a better result. There's actually an arrow in the bottom here where once you click it, it brings you back to these adjustments. So I turned off that other layer. I'm just going to add another one. This one is a levels adjustment layer. This is probably one of the most common tools you'll be using once you get used to actually using this. It's fairly simple. Essentially, the dark scroller that you see on your left hand side controls all the dark elements within the image. So if you move this, it favors that portion of the image, so the darks. If you move the white scroller, then it will start favoring the lights and it'll lighten up the entire image. It works very similar to the contrast, but there is a big difference between this and the contrast is the center one here where I can actually control that. So what this does is, depending on where I increase, so if I move it to the right, I'm increasing the amount of dark elements that are emphasized in this drawing, whereas if I do it onto the left, it's going to favor the lighter elements within this piece. Now you do have to be careful not to overdo this. It is very easy to overdo this, so do be careful when you're using this. Generally, you'll notice after you've used it a couple times that you generally want to have each of these at an area where you see a peak. Now there's certain exceptions to this. I've already applied to this drawing, the original file, some of these elements, so for this reason my curve is actually different than what you would typically see. So I just adjusted it to the way I like. If I want to go back, I can turn it off, it's okay. So the blues became much richer when I used this tool. Now you'll notice too that there's an additional bar, and what this one does is it actually changes your darker elements. So rather than having pure black as my pure black, I can change anything that is within that ratio to a gray element, and that's what happens when you do that. So let's say I want to do the same thing but for the whites. I want to make my whites not white, but I want to make them more of a gray color. I can do that once again. Now you'll probably never use this feature. You'll probably almost exclusively use the graph. So I do recommend that you get comfortable with the graph because that is probably the most important portion to get used to. There is a drop down menu too that's made available to you where you can adjust the individual colors, and once again I don't recommend playing too much with it. It's good to be familiar with it, but in general you're going to want to modify all these elements simultaneously. So I have my image set to CMYK, so mine's set to CMYK. I'm not modifying the cyan, the yellow, the magenta separately, because if I do that then it's harder to anticipate how those effects will interact with my image. But you can get some interesting effects, so just keep that in mind too. Okay, now there is an automated feature here. Once again, it's probably something you're not going to use all too often. However, if you look at right beside the levels here, there is some presets that you may use. So let's say you were editing a bunch of storyboards. You had like 500 storyboards to edit, and they were all scanned in the exact same scanner, exact same paper. The drawings were relatively the same. Then in that case, all you might want to do is just create a custom setting for this so that it automatically applies this setting to whatever image you have. This can save you a lot of work time if you're doing this on a continual basis day after day. So it is notable to notice that you can set this as your own default settings and customize it into your menu here. Now in my case I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to get rid of this entirely and I'm going to go back to this main menu. Here you have something called the curves adjustment layer. So this one's a little bit trickier to get your head around. Once again, you can just adjust the different aspects of CMYK. If you're working in RGB, which is generally for televisions or internet use, anything that has to do with a monitor is not going to be printed. You would be doing your work in RGB mode. I have to deal with printing, so for that reason I use purely, exclusively CMYK and then transfer mine to RGB. But if you're doing monitor-based stuff, you'd be using RGB. Okay, so this one's unique in that normally as a default you have this tool selected, and what this one does is wherever you click it creates a new point and allows you to modify the graph. So if I click this, click and drag it, I can change my graph all at once, and I can favor certain aspects. So it's essentially doing a lot of the same things that the levels layer was doing, but it's all doing it simultaneously and interactively. So I'm not modifying scrollers individually, I'm modifying them all at the same time. Now what you can also do is you can click this and you can actually draw your own curve if you want. There's some other tools here. If you click on this tool here, it automatically allows you to sample what areas are your blacks. It'll set that as a value. Then you can do the same thing for your midtones. So this is probably my midtone right here. And then you could select your whites. And essentially what it's done is it's separated most of these curves to favor your elements within the piece individually. So if I turn this off, there's only a slight modification that occurred, essentially darkened a little bit the darker areas, but it's essentially unchanged, mainly because I have already applied most of these changes to the original image. Okay, so that's the main features of this. These are probably just the features that you would use. I'd use this, be careful when you're using this, just because if you do start modifying the individual curves for the different elements, that could be once again problematic. Also, you do have once again the ability to set a custom setting for this if you need to. Okay, so I'm just going to turn that off and I'm going to go back a menu. Now you can also change your panel to an expanded view if you need to have more control over your elements. I personally generally don't find it necessary. A thumbnail version is normally fine because you won't notice too much the differences if you zoom in. So, okay. So I'm going to go into the Hue and Saturation next. Click that, and now this one's interesting because what it does essentially is it changes the overall color palette as long as you have it set to master and you're not modifying the individual colors within this. It will only modify everything at once. So that's an interesting aspect for this. Once again, you have some presets that are given to you, but you also have the option of creating your own custom presets. But if I move the scroller that has the hue in it, you'll notice that the overall color of the piece changes. So whichever color I require, I can easily change the entire thing with just using this one scroller. Now, if I want to increase the saturation of the color so that the colors are more vibrant, I would use this tool. And what it does is it adds more color to the overall image. Now you do have to be careful because any darker areas tend to get, once again, a little bit washed out because more pigment is actually being added to it. So generally you won't probably need to change this all that much, but it's a good setting to know about. Now if you set this to the full left, then what happens is it essentially sets to grayscale. That is probably much more useful because if you're trying to just check your lighting in the illustration, that's really easy to do. Okay. Now you can, with this scroller, it essentially works the same way as the contrast. So if I move this to the right, it tends to lower the contrast. It also lowers the amount of color though within the piece, whereas if I move it to the left, it darkens the overall color in the piece. There is a colorize button on this, and I don't recommend that you use this just because it doesn't tend to apply any changes that are all that useful from what I've noticed. So I personally don't use this, but you're more than welcome to play around with this if you want to see what it does. Okay, so I'm just going to turn this off and go back once again and choose a different one here. Now we're going to check the color balance. Now in most cases, if you're trying to do a color change, it will be through the hue and saturation. But you do have an additional tool which does modify, once again, the colors, which is the color balance adjustment layer. So I'm going to click that and create that. And essentially what you're doing is you're adjusting either the shadows, the midtone, or the highlights. You do have to select these individually because the default setting is the midtones. And on the far left, you have essentially CMYK, so cyan, magenta, and yellow, but on the right hand side you have RGB, which is red, green, and blue. So what you're doing is by moving the scrollers, you're favoring one of those two colors on each of those scrollers. So if I have it in the center right now for the cyan and red, but if I start moving this to the left, it's going to favor the cyan colors, whereas if I move it to the right, it's going to favor the red colors more. I can do the same with the magenta and the green, and the same with the yellow and the blue. So I've just put my settings back to 0. Now, if you ever need to find out what your colors would be in CMYK versus RGB, the easiest way to do this is just to go to your swatch that you currently have and double click on that, and it'll bring up the color picker, and what it does is it shows you what the values are for CMYK. And so that would be the easiest, because then you can get the actual numbers that you need in percentages, and all you have to do is just type in on Google CMYK converter to RGB, and there's plenty of free software on Google that will happily convert the data for you into the right codes. The same information obviously applies to the shadows and the highlights. You can tinker with those a bit if you need to do some changes, but overall the hue and saturation will probably give you the most control over the color if you're modifying the overall color, so I still recommend just using that. Okay, and the next one is actually called a photo filter. So if you click this, essentially what it does is it creates a color overlay on top of your layer. So if I want all my colors to change to filter a specific color, I can do that. So maybe I want green instead. I can easily do that. Essentially it's adding a color right on top of it, and depending on how far you change the density to left or right, it'll increase it or decrease it. So this is a pretty useful tool, but once again, you probably won't use it all that much unless you're trying to change the overall color of your image, but it's still good to know. So we have also a button called the channel mixer. This one is more complicated because essentially what it's doing is it shows you if you have cyan selected, it'll show you that cyan is obviously set to 100% for this. And if you go to magenta, it essentially shows you how much is favored for that. But if you scroll, let's say in cyan, you scroll this, it will change because it'll decrease how much of the cyan is actually being visible. So how much of the blue is actually mixed in, how much of the cyan is actually mixed in with other colors. Once again, this is probably not a tool that you're going to use just because it's not all that useful. There's better layer options. Like even using a photo filter will give you a bit more options available, so I don't really recommend that either. So I'm just going to turn that off for now. Go back. Okay. This one's actually a pretty cool button. This doesn't have any additional presets though. It's called the Invert button. So if you click this, it creates a new layer, and what it does is it inverts all the color, all the lighting, everything gets inverted. You can get some really nice effects, so depending on what you're trying to achieve, this could actually be a useful tool. But once again, this is an additional tool you probably won't need or use all that often. It's still cool, so it's good to know about, but chances are you probably won't need this. I'm just going to go back here. Posterize, what it does is essentially it simplifies how many colors you actually have within your image. So right now it's set to level 4, but however many I increase it, you'll notice that the gradients are either sharper or more separated because it's limited how many colors are actually being used. So in this case, I essentially have my black, I have a purple, blue, and I have a bit of green actually. So chances are you probably won't use this all that much, but it's still a useful tool to know about. So the threshold, this one's interesting. What it does is it essentially turns everything into black and white. So this is really good depending on what you're trying to use it for, once again. So by scrolling left to right, what it does is it changes at what value is considered to be a black color and what value is considered to be a white color. So it is important, in this case, if I wanted to get more detail in just a character, I would probably edit this character separately from this portion here. So just keep that in mind. It does require some tweaking, but it is a very useful tool depending on what you're using or doing. Okay, and then we have the gradient map. So if you click on here, what it does is you can choose what the gradients do, essentially. So right now I have it set to the first option here, which is the default. If I set it to the next one, it turns essentially everything black. This one here, it's very similar to a grayscale. This one actually alternates the colors completely. Once again, it changes essentially what your whites and black or darker colors are. So if you have dark colors, essentially, in this case, my dark colors became purple, and all my really light colors actually became this orange color. So there's a couple of different ones in here. Depending on how many lines, you can modify this, so keep that in mind. So if I click out of there, and if you click on this, the actual bar here, you can actually add swatches to this. So you can favor this in. You can also save this as a setting if you want. If you click on an area that doesn't have this little cube, you can create a new color. You can double click on this and add a new color. There's a lot of options. I will be covering this tool in a little bit more in later tutorials because this is a useful tool, but it depends on how you use it. So it is applicable, but it depends on what you're using it for. So for now, that's all I'm going to go through, but I will be showing you guys some more about that tool. Okay, and then you have also selective colors. So essentially what you're doing is you're modifying each individual color or a series of colors. It comes with these presets, so you have red, yellow, green, cyan, blues, magenta, whites, neutrals, and blacks. So whichever one you have selected, you can change which ones are favored color-wise within those ratios. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you guys soon. Thank you, and take care.